Yeah, I mean, speaking of a critical month, Nebraska had a critical recruiting weekend last weekend. Obviously, David Sanders Jr. was the highlight, but certainly not the only one. A couple days after that, you had Terry in from Texas as well. I mean, as we sit here, let's just start with those two guys because they're the headliners as being, the five-star guys. What realistically do you put Nebraska's chances at for those guys?
I mean, I think right now, someone asked me this a couple of days ago, and this was before I had heard back on Terry's visit, and I said Sanders' chances are higher than Terry. Right now, I would put Terry at 40%, and I'd put Sanders at 35%. A little bit of an adjustment from earlier this week. Sanders, I think, remains just at 35%, just because I still keep hearing Tennessee's on top. People keep telling me to not count out Ohio State just yet, and then. I mean, I don't hear a whole lot about Georgia, but at the same time, I don't think Georgia's a program you ever want to count out of a recruitment right now. What I'll say there is, I think at this point, everyone can gather Nebraska made a really big impression last week to the point that, like, they're getting real consideration. I think consideration to the point that it's scaring Tennessee, Ohio State, and Georgia a little bit, just how much Nebraska is being considered here down this final stretch of this recruitment. So Nebraska's done a really good job. I think it just really just kind of depends on what him and his family are thinking. Like, I think one thing that continues to loom for me is, everyone I've talked to around this recruitment, especially when Nebraska got involved early on, was distance was always going to be a factor here and is always going to be a factor. He's a family guy. I think everyone can gather that too, the way he came up with his siblings and his parents. Like, he's a big family guy. And I think the opportunity for his family to be at games is something he's really looking to have. And Nebraska's done the best of like pitching, hey, even though we're a little further from home, here's why this makes sense. I still think that proximity to home kind of looms, and like when it's a decision as close as this, I kind of feel like that's something that's going to end up coming out on top is, hey, I can play 6 hours from home instead of 12 to 15, with Terry on the other side, it's a little. I think it's coming down to Texas and Nebraska. I think this recruitment's kind of swung back into what it was in the spring, where if he's going to leave the state, it's going to be for Nebraska. But it's going to be hard to overcome just his fondness for Texas, the proximity to home, everything that Texas kind of has to offer him specifically, and. I think it's coming down to those two. I think this last Nebraska visit was enough to give Nebraska just a slight edge over Oregon going down the stretch, and it's more than NIL here. It's NIL paired with so many different factors that Nebraska's long-term presence in this recruitment gave them, which Oregon, being a newer program in this recruitment, doesn't really have.
So, Tim, is Oregon a school of the newbies? And maybe not, because I think a lot of times Nebraska couldn't really foresee head-to-head battles with like Ohio State or even Michigan for that matter. And I may go as far out as Penn State. But there is some overlapping in this last cycle quite a bit with Oregon. Coincidence, part of the cycle that kind of can be cyclical, no pun intended there. Or do you think Oregon is a team, the way that Lanning likes to recruit, that you could, and now being in the same conference, that you could see showing up in some Nebraska discussions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Dan
kind of
Lanning,
weird, isn't it, for a newbie? Like,
right.
We don't even have a ton of overlapping with like teams that we had been in the conference with.
Right. I mean, the thing with Oregon is they kind of recruit in a way where they truly believe no prospect is off the board for them, just in the sense that, like, there's no area they won't go into. But I will say that two hotbeds for them right now, just because of coaching relationships and things, Dan Lanning really knows the Kansas City area real well. Like, he knows Kansas, he knows Missouri, he knows those two real well. You've seen him kind of establish and maintain a presence in Missouri, just in terms of like consistently offering guys and making a presence there. Obviously, they've got Mozee committed, but like that's not the only one. They've kind of maintained a presence in Missouri. They're going to continue doing that because of Dan Lanning's just background in that city. And then on the other side, their offensive coordinator, Will Stein, that's an awesome, like, he's from Texas. He coached at UTSA. He's got some strong relationships down in Texas. those are two areas that Texas Nebraska and Oregon kind of overlap is trying to establish themselves in Texas and again, like trying to lock down Kansas City. So I think you're going to keep running into Oregon on the trail, and not just there. Like again, Oregon they kind of believe and operate in that we can recruit where we want. You know, they're pushing in the Midwest. I think you're going to see it in this 26 cycle. This Midwest group in 26 is really impressive, and Nebraska's involved with a lot of these guys, obviously, but Oregon's involved with a lot of these guys as well. And like when I say 26, I mean like there's specifically like tight ends, O-line, some D-linemen, and even some like corners and DBs like in the Midwest this upcoming cycle. It's kind of loaded in this region.
We're talking with Tim Verghese of Inside Nebraska. Tim, you mentioned Mozee, the current Oregon commit. Obviously, his dad now on staff at Nebraska. How do you view his continued recruitment? I know a lot of people just expect him to flip because of the relationship there, but where are you at on that?
Again, I think still holding. I think kind of feels like one of those matter of time situations at this point. But I mean, I know Oregon's obviously still having some dialogue. I would say one thing to keep an eye on is I wouldn't be surprised if a school like Missouri sees that, you know, he's open to looking around and is circling back there as well, just being like, hey, you know, the option isn't just Nebraska. Like, we're here too. Missouri pushed for a while before he committed to Oregon initially. So again, wouldn't be surprised if they kind of make a little run too. But at this point, it feels like a matter of time for Nebraska. And I think Nebraska kind of put themselves over the top this past weekend just with the pitch they had for him on what he'd look like in the offense, and just kind of made him feel again at home. Like that's not been Nebraska's done a really good job of consistently make him feel comfortable on campus, and now having his dad there, I think that just only helps them. Like, UCF didn't recruit Isaiah when Jamar was there for a reason. I think they kind of had an inkling that Jamar was eventually going to head somewhere closer to home, and they knew kind of Isaiah wouldn't really go to UCF because that was a temporary spot for his dad. But Nebraska's not that type of situation for either of them.
It's interesting because I know, Ravi's such a Deion Sanders fan. I think he loves the fact that he can only coach his kids. Some kids don't like to be around their parents if they're coaches in that regard. Like if proximity was a thing when dad was in Kansas City, you'd think he may have already stayed closer, but he wanted to go to Oregon, obviously, for whatever those reasons are. Did you think it's just a foregone conclusion that he would come back and be with dad? Because I don't always get that impression between the two.
It definitely wasn't a foregone conclusion, but I think the visit did enough to put them over the top just off the overall staff. Because the thing with him was like it always felt like home at Nebraska beyond my dad being here. Like it always felt like a family atmosphere. And then now having dad here only helps that. But then on top of that, I do think more than anything, like the role in the offense was something he was pitched on, and I think he's looking at the depth chart at Nebraska. And he's looking at the depth chart in Oregon, plus the recruiting class Oregon has. They have the number 1 receiver in the country committed, the number 5 or 6 receiver in the country committed. Like they've got a pretty loaded wide receiver room coming in. And of course, they're still after Michael Terry, just like Nebraska is. So I think he's looking at both of those and seeing like, okay, Nebraska's pitching me on seeing the field early. So is Oregon. What's more realistic? I feel like Nebraska is more realistic at this point. So
which is pretty impressive because Nebraska's young wide receiving core is pretty good.
Yes, and but
that's not even counting Demetrius Bell.
Right, exactly. And again, that is not to take away from who Nebraska has right now, who Nebraska's bringing in. I will say this too: Nebraska's currently got a wide receiver commit in Bryson Hayes from Mays, Kansas. Bryson can play.
Yeah, the speedster.
Like that. That's a guy that, and you look at Mozee and you're like, okay, this is a guy that kind of fits in the slot. Does a lot of things you want to see in the slot. So is Bryson, and Bryson does a lot of those things at a very high level. Like I think he's a little underrated just because no one's really been out to see him at Mays. Last time people were out at Mays was when Avery Johnson was there, but that was when Bryson was a sophomore. So he wasn't really super featured in the offense. But we're gonna get eyes on him this fall. Hopefully, kind of push for that rankings bump because that's one of the better slots in the country, in my opinion.
Tim, we were talking about earlier Nebraska competing with Oregon for a lot of these recruits, and it reminded me of this conversation DB and I were having earlier. I don't remember if it was this week, last week. I don't know. Time always, melts together. But about Nebraska's ceiling as a school in terms of recruiting, because we've talked to people who are like, they can kind of live in that 15 to 20 range. But then you look at, okay, that's not where Oregon's living, and they're going head to head with Oregon for a lot of these. And Nebraska hasn't even started to win yet. Like, as you kind of put together, you've kind of seen up close the way they recruit people. If Nebraska starts to win, what's their ceiling as a team recruiting, like in sort of team rankings, the way you guys do them?
I think team rank. I think you can really push into at least competing for the top 10 or being just outside of the top 10 yearly if you start to string some wins together. I think it needs to be a combination of a couple of things, because think about what Nebraska has to offer on the trail. They've got, again, this is all before winning. You've got relationships. I think the staff, and this is not just like me saying this because I cover Nebraska. This is me talking to recruits across the country that are considering Nebraska and aren't considering Nebraska. Nebraska does as good of a job as anybody building and maintaining relationships. The guys feel comfortable at Nebraska. They feel like they've got a genuine relationship with the staff. And they feel wanted at Nebraska. Nebraska does a good job of maintaining consistent communication. And then the facilities is something I think a lot of people are kind of understating on the recruiting trail. That's something that guys really look for. And again, I kept hearing it this week from guys that made it to campus the first time. They're like, oh, it reminded me of Oregon's facilities. Someone else said Texas A&M is the only other school that can really compare to what Nebraska has to offer from the facility standpoint. So this was a recruit that was coming off an Alabama visit. Like, he's telling me this, like, walking out of Alabama, and he's like, hey, Nebraska's facilities are up there with Texas A&M's and no one else's. Like, so I think guys are really impressed with the facilities Nebraska has to offer. Guys are really impressed with the relationships. They feel at home in Lincoln. For a lot of the Midwest guys, it's proximity to home. For pretty much everyone else they're recruiting, it's at least driving distance or like there's a convenient flight. It's not hard to get to. And then you top it off with just the development opportunities. Like, Rule has that in his resume. Terrence Knighton has that in his resume. Like, a lot of these guys on staff, and it'll take a couple of years for them to truly build that at Nebraska specifically, but they have a resume they can point to and be like, hey, we have a track record of doing this, of finding talent and developing it. And I think those combination of factors make you a real threat on the recruiting trail, especially once you win and you don't have to sell, hey, we're building something. Like, when you can say, okay, it's built, like we're winning. We just need to keep stacking talent. That the recruiting will naturally, when you win, recruiting naturally takes care of itself. Pair that with the effort the staff's already putting in. I think that's like a combination and a good like recipe for consistent top 10 recruiting classes. I think the one question there would just be, again, you feel like you're competitive in an NIL standpoint. How competitive really are you? We haven't really found that out yet because they haven't had to bag multiple kids a cycle just yet. When you get to that point where you're recruiting top 10, you do have to do that. Like, unfortunately, that is the way it works, is to recruit at a very, very high level. You do have to outbid some other schools for multiple recruits. Nebraska has to prove they can do that with, 10, 15 guys in a class, not just 5 to 10 guys in a class.
Right. So, Tim, let me ask you, because TV, inevitably the question I was posing to Ravi, and it was a fascinating back and forth. And I didn't think he was super crazy, especially with Nebraska's brand, because that's the one thing I don't think we talked about enough is they have a huge brand nationally. But somebody has to get jumped or hurdled. If you're going to move into a neighborhood, somebody's got to be coming out. When you look at teams, I'm just going to stay in the Big Ten with Michigan, Ohio State, obviously SC and Oregon. And I'm going to say Penn State, even though we did a composite dive last week. Penn State hasn't nearly recruited at as high a level as I thought. Certainly not as high as the equivalency of James Franklin's winning percentage. He wins a lot more games than he recruits in terms of talent, in my opinion. Who's most vulnerable to be ran down if you're going to kind of move into that neighborhood?
Yeah, I think the funny thing with Penn State is they really spot recruit well, like you mentioned. I don't think they necessarily ranked super high consistently, but you always think of them as a top school because they pretty much once or twice every year they land 1 or 2 5-stars that they just like really dial in on. Like
Yeah,
they
maybe
do a
that,
good
that
job.
might be it.
They do a really good job of dialing in on their guys. And yeah, I mean, but I will say I think they're a little vulnerable to get run down. I think the Franklin era is getting a little stale, and they need to, kind of make that leap at some point. Otherwise, they're just kind of, just spinning their tires. And obviously, I think Franklin's job is one that's under scrutiny pretty much every season, it feels like.
Maybe does Michigan recruit as well as they're given credit for? It doesn't. It doesn't seem like it on paper.
No, that's the thing under Harbaugh. And again, I covered them under Harbaugh. Like the frustrating thing with Jim Harbaugh's Michigan was they never got involved with the recruitments they probably should have. That is changing though now. Like you look at the guys Sharon Moore is involved in themselves with, the guys they're getting on campus now. They're recruiting like a program that just won a national championship now. They weren't doing that under Harbaugh. Like even post championship, they didn't make this momentum push because pretty much what inevitably happened, and this went on for the last 5 off seasons or so, they'd finish the season, and again, especially the last 3 years or so, they'd end the season on a high note, and then Jim Harbaugh would entertain the NFL, killing whatever recruiting momentum they'd built up with on-field results. On-field results got them in a lot of recruitments that they chose to back themselves out of just because of the staff or because of Harbaugh or because something was going on, and they never really recruited like a program, and it never really mattered because Harbaugh wanted his guys. They felt they could develop at a high level, but they don't have those like developers in the room anymore. Now they're at a point where, okay, we are a big national brand. Okay, we can be a little looser on the recruiting trail. We can play in the NIL pit a little more. And I think that's helping them a little bit. So they're recruiting at a higher level, but I think the question with them now is, can they maintain the success they had under Harbaugh? Because if that doesn't happen, I think they lend themselves vulnerable to getting run down a little bit. I'd also add USC in there because I think Lincoln Riley needs to prove it, like post coming out of the Caleb Williams era. And I also think they're making some weird decisions on the recruiting trail. Like they are trying to make Georgia a hotbed for them. And I don't really get why. Like I get Georgia has a lot of talent. I get you have relationships there, but it's really tough to sell coming all the way across the country year after year when you're not going to play anywhere close to Georgia on any road games.
Also, Georgia has Georgia in it as well.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, on top of all of that, it's like, yes, you're going into a state that like Alabama and Auburn and Florida and LSU and Texas, like everyone's trying to recruit that state, and you're the one that's furthest away with, especially because what they're trying to do is they're focusing on the defensive side of the ball too. You have the least to offer on that side too. You don't have like a track record of success on the defensive side of the ball to go sell. We have a new coaching staff on the defensive side of the ball to sell. And, if you get results this year, you potentially have that to sell. But again, you're not overcoming Georgia in Georgia. You're not overcoming Florida, not overcoming Bama. Like, come on.
Yeah, your best case scenario is like every once in a while we beat out Auburn.
Right.
The question for me with Nebraska is, can I make the argument that because Nebraska's always sort of had to recruit nationally just because of their location and the population, that they're actually set up better to recruit at a high level than if they do start winning than they were to kind of recruit at that mid-level, because regionally there's just not, in state there hasn't typically been that same level of talent. Like they've had to have these relationships nationally, so it kind of sets them up well to recruit at a national level. Can I make that argument to you?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing with recruiting is you want to be on people's minds, and Nebraska, just because of the national network they have, is constantly on people's minds. And so when you do start to win, like I think fans across the country kind of come out of the woodworks a little bit. Coaches who like were fond of Nebraska growing up will be like, hey, Nebraska used to be dominant back in the day. They're kind of getting back to that. Like they're telling that to their kids. Like, we've talked a lot about Oregon today, just about how they're a new power. I think the big thing with Oregon, what kept them at the top of people's minds when, they went through all these different coaching changes and now that they're recruiting at this level, kids remember growing up and watching Oregon and seeing those cool uniforms on TV and Oregon being one of their favorite programs growing up because of the uniforms. There was a familiarity there. Nebraska has that same familiarity, not because of uniforms, but because of program tradition. And I think that's something that has not been really tapped into just yet because there haven't been results. And it's not been something that like fans can go out and be proud to be a Nebraska fan. Like when you get back to that point where fans are proud, I think Nebraska's like national like presence is going to like, you know, just kind of come back to light.
That's Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Tim, we appreciate the time as always. And I'm sure you'll be busy the next month, so we'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, TV.
Talk soon. Have a good weekend.